Okay, I'm Deborah DeLange, and you can call me Debbie. I'm a professor at Ryerson University in global management studies. So my PhD is in strategic management, and everything I do is underpinned by sustainability. So through that statement, you will understand that Gord and I are on the same page. I absolutely agree with everything he had to say, and so I'm probably just going to add to what he said. Just to give you a little bit more background on who I am, I'm a business strategy advisor at the Digital Media Zone. I'm also a business strategy advisor for the Center for Urban Energy, which is essentially clean tech. And at Ryerson University, what we're doing is just revolutionary in terms of building up the city, and we're doing that not only through academics, but also through incubators and research. Incubators that represent each of the industries that are in our great city, but on the high-tech side. So we have the digital side, we have the energy side, we have fashion zone. We're building up an advanced manufacturing zone. We've got a partnership with Bombardier and the University of Toronto in aerospace. We're looking at biotech partnerships. So every high-tech important industry in the city we're building up, and we're doing that through all of these different zones and or partnerships with others around the city. So these are the things some of the things that I'm also invested in terms of my time. And so I work with entrepreneurs, and I make connections, and I identify entrepreneurs to see, who has a lot of potential to join us in our incubators. So of course, clean tech is essentially my greatest interest. And clean tech for me is the implementation of solutions to climate change ultimately. What drives me is an understanding that we have to, people talk about mitigating climate change, we have to stop climate change. And I think that Gord has given you a very good idea of many of the consequences and many of the things that are happening with respect to climate change. So, the United Nations has its Millennium Development Goals, and it's working towards achieving those goals. But essentially, the United Nations is really setting the strategy for all of us. And that's what I want you to think about. The United Nations is an international body, and this is where I think I can add to this conversation because I am an international business professor. I'm going to give you more of the international view, and then we're going to put Canada into that setting, into that international setting. And so my dissertation actually looked at all these different international networks and how they influence decision making in the United Nations General Assembly. But so the United Nations has really, through its Millennium Development Goals, set out the goals for us as people on this planet. Things that we all need to work towards in all different ways. We can work towards those goals in all different ways. And one of those is related to environmental sustainability. But of course, if we don't have a healthy planet, I'm not sure that any of the other goals matter because ultimately we don't really exist if we don't have a healthy planet. And this is where I put my priority on the health of this planet because ultimately this is our fishbowl. If we pollute and destroy the fishbowl that we live in, you can imagine a fish in a fishbowl, it can't jump out of the water and survive. Once that water is polluted, it dies. And so you can think of us as being that fish in that fishbowl. If we destroy the fishbowl, then there's nowhere else for us to go. So this is really a very serious issue. We all have to recognize it, and quite frankly, in this country, we're not recognizing it well enough. A big part of it is, as suggested by Gord, that we're not getting the right messages. We're not being given the information is not being provided to us. And I don't even have cable because I've heard about the advertisements from the oil industry and all the kinds of things that are going on, and I really don't pay attention to that because I listen to I read the New York Times, I read The Economist, I read international news. And this is what we all have to do. We have to pay attention to what the international news tells us and what the IPCC report tells us. Because what we're getting in this country is a different kind of news. And it, you know, going back to the Bush era, you may know that, you know, Fox News and Bush, you know, they really changed the way the United States works. You know, when I was here, you know, I've been here and I've worked in the United States, and before I went away to the US as a professor, I heard Al Gore speak. After, you know, it was after he lost the election, and a little bit after that, but before he really, you know, took up that environmental stance. But he was saying, you know, the United States has changed the way it thinks as a whole, as a culture. And you know, there's globalization going on, and it's really threatening to a lot of people. And so they're holding on to these pillars of kind of tradition. And because globalization, meaning all the changes that are going on, is scary. And so what happens is people can be told all sorts of stories that actually don't make any sense. So, you know, what Al Gore, and I heard Kipper Gore, his wife, speak also at the same time, and I just thought, wow, you know, they're really sending a message of truth and of empathy and sympathy, of course, for all of us, of all of humankind in this earth. And the problem is that that was not the message that was being sent to the American people, and unfortunately, the U.S. and Canada and Australia, we tend to have a connected culture, shall I say. And so through that connectedness, we seem to adopt similar points of view. And so when we have an American leader that through the media is twisting the views of 330 million people, and we're in an English kind of world that includes us and the Australians, for example, and the British, of course, then all of a sudden we start changing the way we view the world. And very often Canadian politics follows American politics. So you can see, you know, they had Bush, and now we've got Harper, and he seems to be the follow-on of Bush. And now they've got Obama, so that they're actually ahead of us in a lot of ways, because you know, they're moving forward, but we're moving backward. And it is very much about a twisted philosophy that is also delivered through a media that is being manipulated. So, you know, I can go through a lot of the types of manipulations that are going on. I think that, you know, David Suzuki, how many people here know David Suzuki? A very famous scientist. He is a fantastic scientist, and he is constantly talking about the kinds of things that I'm talking about, the kinds of things that Al Gore is talking about, the kinds of things that Gord Miller here is talking about, and he's trying to wake up Canadians to understand that we're not being sent the messages that everyone else, quite frankly, or most others in the modern world understand. So I was in Washington, D.C. in November, and at that meeting I met with climate scientists and business people, and of course we had academics there. And what we were talking about was business resilience. What is business resilience? What does that mean? Well, it means that we're expecting an awful lot of storms and changes to our weather patterns that are going to have such significant effects that businesses need to start planning for how to design their businesses to be resilient in the face of all those changes. And there were a lot of insurance companies there. Because you can imagine, like, are we going to insure businesses when we see Hurricane Sandy actually practically destroying for a period of time Manhattan? When in history have we ever seen Manhattan essentially shut down?
Hurricanes have been with us always.
Sorry?
Hurricanes have been with us always.
Yeah. So we have an accelerating rate of storms on a level that we have never actually seen before. And
I'd like to see the measure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you can watch A Convenient Truth by Al Gore. Al Gore will give you a very good review of all the facts on that. So what we're looking at is a situation where we are actually having discussions in Washington, D.C. with insurance companies and businesses, with climate change scientists, to discuss what are businesses going to do. And really, what is the point of those discussions? To get across to business that you're not going to be able to accommodate or estimate all the changes you need to make to actually have a resilient business in the face of all these changes. And so what we do is we start thinking forward in order to then go back and say, well, maybe we should just stop all of this from happening in the first place. Okay? So, you know, if you get businesses to think about what if this happens and what if that happens, what if this storm happens, but you know what, I can't predict how that's going to affect my business. I can't possibly know. So how do I prepare for that? And then the insurance companies are along the same line. How can they possibly estimate with all their actuaries and all the calculations that they do? Guess what? Those calculations are based on history. But if we can't predict the future based on history because the patterns are completely changing, the insurance companies can't predict what their future business is going to be like, and how can they insure those businesses, and how can the businesses predict anything in the first place. So maybe it's just better to step back and stop it from happening in the first place. I mean, and that ultimately is the message when we have those kinds of meetings, because it just makes more sense to avoid it, right? So what I want everyone here to think about is how do we see the future? What is our vision of the future? And do we want it to be a better one? So first of all, what does sustainability mean? Sustainability means considering the economic, social, and environmental aspects in equal balance. Ultimately, what we have today is an unbalanced world. We're destroying our natural environment, and that's because we have an unbalanced world. And it's unbalanced across those three things, right? Because we're focusing on one of them, and we're forgetting the other two. Okay? But sustainability is also about thinking about future generations. And this is what we seem to lose sight of. I mean, when we're digging out, and we are digging, we are not drawing out, in the tar sands. They are tar sands, by the way, they are not oil sands. And we always used to refer to what is in Alberta as tar sands, but all of a sudden in recent times, again, the media has told us somehow that these are oil sands. It is bitumen. Bitumen is something that is dug out of the ground and then mixed with other oils, and then it becomes oil, becomes something that actually flows. So what we are doing is we are telling these stories in Canada so that we can justify an industry that is taking as much out of the ground as fast as they can, because guess why? They know that the rest of the world knows that we're changing, as was suggested by Gord Miller a few minutes ago. The world is changing, but Canada is not. Why? Because we have such great reserves of oil, and it's not convenient for the oil companies for us to recognize that. Ultimately, what do we become? We become a labor pool for the oil industry. How do you feel about that? So when we look at Norway, for example, they have a sovereign wealth fund. And you know what? They take great advantage of the oil reserves that they have access to. Fantastic advantage, but they also have a sovereign wealth fund, and what that means is they set aside massive amounts of money so that they don't get into a situation where all their other industries devolve. Because what happens when people are being paid massive amounts to work in the oil industry, all the other industries, high-tech, secondary and tertiary industries, cannot pay the same kinds of salaries. So all the resources, we call this resource dependence theory. It's a kind of Dutch disease that develops. All the resources in a country without government policies in place go towards that industry where everyone can make the most money for a period of time, of course. And then all the other secondary and tertiary industries start devolving. And that's what we're seeing here. Do you know that I have friends who used to be electrical engineers? That's my first degree. And they used to go down and work in Silicon Valley, but you know what? Now they're recruiting for the oil industry because there's more money to be made there. Because someone who is quote unquote maybe low education in the oil industry is making $140,000 a year, whereas a manufacturing engineer is making about $75,000. So you can imagine our labor pool, our labor force goes into the oil industry. What happens to the other industries? They start devolving. Now Norway understands this. So Norway has put in policies to avoid the de-evolution of all of its other industries, and they've created a sovereign wealth fund so that they control their oil industry. The oil industry doesn't control their oil reserves. We've given up. So I'm not an advocate of taking oil out of the earth at all. But if you're going to do it, at least negotiate and be smart about it, and have a government take that's a large enough percentage so that some wealth goes back into the country. But that's not what's happening in Canada. We don't even have anyone negotiating on our part anymore. Okay. What we have is a situation where we actually have the oil industry representing us. We are a labor pool for the oil industry these days, and we don't understand that, and we need to start understanding that, and look outwards to what the rest of the world is doing. Even if it is another country that is surviving on its oil, Norway is doing such a better job. You know, because it's maintaining its other industries, and it's developed a huge. We don't have a sovereign wealth fund. Where is our fund? And why isn't our government putting together this fund for us? Because all the money is going to the oil industry. It's not going to Canada. We are the worst from a governmental standpoint, at least at the federal level. We are the worst. We are not. There's no one to negotiate for us. We're not standing up for our rights, for what we own. But ultimately, we shouldn't be digging this stuff out of the ground and burning it anyway, because it contributes to destroying the rest of the earth. So what does Canada become historically from the perspective of the rest of the world? Are we contributing to the betterment of the rest of the world, or are we actually becoming pariahs on the world stage? And that's what I want to leave you with. I want you to think about who we are as Canadians. What have we stood for in the past, and what have we become? Thanks very much.